All right, welcome everyone to another episode of 10-Minute Poker Tips. I have a special guest today, Jennifer Shahade. She is a 3x national chess champion, a women's grandmaster, a best-selling author. She is not only a professional poker player, but she's also a Pokerstars Pro, and she has a podcast with Pokerstars called The Grid. You know, Jennifer, it might be easier to do an intro if we talk about the things that you don't do. But thank you so much for coming on this show. It's an honor to have you.
Yeah, I'm so excited.
So what we're going to be talking about today is something very near and dear to your heart, and you also happen to be a master in. There may not be more people in the world that has expertise in this than you, which is game theory. But game theory is something that's deeply rooted in mathematics, and it's like a real discipline. It's economics, it's computer science, but I think it's become an overloaded, like hand-wavy term. So how would you actually define game theory?
I think it's a study of decision making and strategic decision making where our decisions are connected to other people's decisions. For me, I feel like it's just a great way to kind of conceptualize poker and chess. These are my favorite games and kind of what we can learn from them that can help us in our lives outside the game.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. And I think that is, the difference between just general strategy and game theory. It is about whether it's two or it's multiple players in a specific game or a hand of poker. It is how all your decisions impact each other and how you find basically the optimal way to play.
Right. Yeah. And I know there's a lot of back and forth with poker players and how important they think like GTO strategies are to study. I think maybe like 8 to 10 years ago, or even 6 years ago when I started my podcast, The Poker Grade, I felt like there was a lot of pushback against it. They thought it was something that was pretty nerdy to study
Yeah.
too much game theory and that it didn't really help you as much as people thought it did because nobody plays like that. But then came the pandemic, and I felt like a lot of people just had a lot of time to themselves. And finally, they were like, learn to knit, learn game theory, learn solver. Like everybody had this like list of things they meant to get to, right? And I felt like that was checked off a lot of people's lists. So they kind of got a lot more comfortable with the idea that even if you don't play like that, it can help you visualize poker and actually be more creative, not less creative. So that was an interesting moment. And now I think we're kind of coming full circle again. And people are like, oh, maybe it did go too far again. Because ultimately, like to me, poker kind of means figuring out where your opponent is, right? And trying to kind of read people. There's something about the word poker that almost means like to me, like playing poker is getting a good vibe about whether you should call or not, right? And game theory can certainly help you in some ways figure that out, but I think more and more people are realizing, like I heard Phil Galfond talking about it in his newsletters, his videos. I heard all sorts of YouTubers just kind of talking about how important it is to realize that if you're trying to randomize or you're trying to play like that, maybe you're missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, and I think the GTO purists sometimes do stick to the very technical definitions of game theory and what optimal play is. And basically even looking at something like a mixed strategy as an example, which is I know something that you've talked about and written about before. They do really feel like randomization is like the purpose of it, right? But when applied to poker, perhaps it's really not, because there's very few times where you have zero information on what your opponent is doing, even when you're playing online.
Right, but it's still super fun to study those mixed strategies. And I wrote about that in my Substack in part because I've been watching the Beast games
Oh yeah.
with Mr. Beast because my son is 8 years old and he's like a huge fan of Mr. Beast, and so we watched that series, and every time there was kind of like a mathematical decision, because this comes up in all of his videos where he like offers people like either to take 20K or to have like a 50-50 shot at like 80K. And that's a very simple example, but he does stuff like that quite a lot. And usually if you start unraveling what he's doing, a lot of times he's playing other people against each other.
Yeah.
And a lot of these are really mathematical concepts. And I mean, I have mixed feelings about some of the challenges that he puts on, but I really do think that if you break it down to math, it could be quite interesting and, useful for people to learn about.
Yeah, how would you, direct maybe like an average person who doesn't have that much time, maybe it doesn't have a strong mathematical background, on how they can maybe just catch up with game theory a little bit, just so they can watch Beast games and understand the root of the game and maybe what roughly optimal strategy might be?
I think a big part of it is to slow down, because one of the issues I think with so much, our world is so sped up, and a lot of times we just want things to be written in a way that we can like absorb it in like a minute or 2 minutes, like in a nice little Twitter thread and I think that sometimes you really do need a little bit longer. Now, I'm not talking like hours, but even like your podcast, 10 minutes. Because I'll never forget, one of the great poker players in the world, Dan Dvoris, like one time I was talking to him about something, it was years ago. And I said, that I don't feel, I think it was something about like leading in a certain spot where most people just check to the aggressor. And he's like, well, if you think about the spot for 10 to 15 minutes, you're going to be ahead of what other people have done.
Right.
Well, he's like, actually just think about it. Like sit down and think about it, right? And that really struck me because I'm like, yeah, that's true. Like a lot of people just don't want to think for 10 to 15 minutes about something by themselves. And hey, I mean, whether it's chess or poker, that's kind of the game to know that ultimately, as much as you've prepared, you sometimes just are left with yourself and your own thoughts. And that is scary, but also empowering.
Yeah, I think people underestimate how much they can solve just about thinking through things from first principles. But we're talking about like mixed strategies in pokers, and I suppose that the fundamental purpose of solvers is to output for you a bunch of different strategies that you can apply to any given hand. But then if we also hand wave that away, and especially say in a live poker setting, you got to read on a player, even if it's a rough read, that should usually just tell you to go pick one of these decisions, and that's probably going to be the optimal one. That might not be the highest EV one, that might not be the highest frequency one, but this is just the best one, right? So what would you say to people who tell you then, well, okay, so what is the purpose of me ever learning solvers? Like, is there a point for me to learn solvers if I'm just going to throw away the outputs most of the time?
Well, I think it's kind of nice to be able to see all the hands that your opponent might have and like conceptually visualize them. And then also as players, participate in tournaments, they know that their opponents might be playing similar ranges. So it's like super valuable to know what they might be playing. Like, yeah, sure, the further the hand goes along, maybe people don't play like that, but I'm sure there's a lot of people who play pretty similar to solvers in terms of the pre-flop ranges. So you definitely want to know what people are doing there. That seems really valuable, right? And I think it's more just like if you're using it as a substitute for thinking instead of a supplement in game. And I have such a strong experience in this because in chess, we've had these super powered computers for many, many more years. I think it's been probably about 10, 15 years that you could just get on your computer, like an engine that is the best player in the world, basically, right? In 1997, Gary Kasparov famously lost to Deep Blue in the man versus machine match in New York City. But the truth was that, like, that was a little premature. Like, at that time, like, Gary Kasparov, if you played that match 20 times, he would probably be the winner more than 10 times. Mm-hmm. He was just, like, in the unlucky bad
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it would have happened, but it was a little bit premature. It probably would have been like a few more years.
Yeah.
And it was a bit unfortunate. I kind of felt for him because there was a lot of controversy involved with that match, and like he wanted a rematch because he felt that too. He thought he could win, but from the technology point of view, it's like once they beat him once, they didn't want a rematch. So if he had won, they would have gotten a rematch. But when he loses, he doesn't get a rematch. It's not there, right?
Well, I hope we learned a lesson from there is that anytime we have human versus machine, we should do like a best 1 out of 5, right? Just to make sure we get a little bit more statistical significance into the results.
Yeah, but where I was going with that was like, yes, computer engines and chats are just so strong, but there's a limit of what they can tell you if you don't think for yourself, because sometimes they also don't. And I think this is really similar to poker, actually. Like if you're studying chess with a computer and you don't think for yourself and you don't have like a friend or a coach who can kind of steer you in the right direction, you might look at the computer line and it'll say like, oh, if they play this move, you can play that move.
Yeah.
But any human, from like the best player in the world to like one who's, a talented amateur, would be like, but wait, can't they just take your rook? And the computer already sees that taking the rook leads to like mate and 3. But if you don't go through that process, you don't understand anything. Like you're just like not getting it. It's almost just totally useless. It's almost like you become dumber rather than smarter, right? And I think that's very similar to poker. Like you see the same kind of progression where like if you're not asking the right questions, anything that you're learning can just be like, woo, yeah.